For decades, Delhi's urban growth model relied on horizontal expansion, pushing the city's borders outward into endless low-rise sprawl. Now, the regulatory framework is forcing that mass inward, aiming to consolidate the population into hyper-dense vertical nodes. The mechanism driving this contraction is the 2026 modifications to the Master Plan for Delhi 2021, specifically the Transit-Oriented Development, or TOD, policy. This map shows the regulatory boundaries of the new TOD zones, a specific footprint overlaid on the city's infrastructure. The zoning only applies within a strict 500-meter radius around approved DMRC metro, RRTS, and high-speed rail stations. Plots outside this boundary do not qualify. By restricting these allowances to the immediate vicinity of major hubs, the government is using billions of dollars of public rail investment as gravity. They are leveraging that infrastructure to pull private capital into building compact, mixed-use developments exactly where the transit capacity already exists. Participation in the TOD policy is strictly voluntary. To convince property owners to abandon their existing structures and rebuild, the regulatory framework offers a highly lucrative mathematical incentive. That incentive is controlled by the Delhi Development Authority. The DDA acts as the central nodal authority, managing the approvals and distributing the density rights required to make these projects financially viable. The core economic lever is floor area ratio, or FAR, the metric dictating how much total floor space a developer can build relative to their land size. Under the TOD policy, standard zoning limits are lifted, guaranteeing a participating developer a baseline FAR of 400. There is a higher ceiling. Developers can push their density to an absolute maximum FAR of 500. However, accessing that top 100 points of FAR is conditional upon the payment of specific, elevated TOD and additional FAR charges directly to the DDA. This introduces a strict geometric tension. The developer buys the right to build a massive amount of square footage, but they must figure out how to mathematically pack that raw volume into the legal confines of a single physical parcel of land. Scaling down to a single plot, a developer faces three constraints. First, the plot must be at least 2,000 square meters. Second, 50% of it must sit inside the 500-meter TOD zone. Finally, it must connect directly to an 18-meter approach road. These dimensional floors act as a filter. The 2,000 square meter minimum ensures the site is large enough to physically house the required multi-use amenities. The 18-meter road width guarantees that the sudden influx of high-density residents won't choke the surrounding street network. The challenge is that developers cannot simply cover the entire 2,000 square meters in concrete. The 500 AFR allowance is heavily restricted by a mandatory horizontal footprint limit. Developers build on just 40% of the plot, squeezed by 9-meter front and 6-meter side setbacks. Exactly 10% becomes green space. Extruding this footprint vertically yields a 400 AFR volume, pushing to a maximum 500 AFR once DDA premiums are paid. The geometry here is deliberate. By clamping down on ground coverage and pushing the volume vertically, developers trade their horizontal footprint for sky rights. The result guarantees that 60% of the ground level remains open to the air. Constructing the physical envelope of the 500 FAR is only the first step. The DDA strictly dictates what actually happens inside that volume. To prevent single-use ghost towns, the building requires a vertical mix. 65% of the FAR is reserved for smaller residential units. 10% must house commercial spaces. The remaining 25% is flexible for larger apartments, offices, or studios. This 65-10-25 ratio is the economic engine of the site. It guarantees a critical mass of local residents living in smaller units, sitting directly on top of commercial services. The zoning forces the creation of a self-sustaining micro-neighborhood that generates its own internal foot traffic, completely independent of car travel. But a high-density tower cannot function in isolation. The master plan includes specific mandates on how this private volume physically integrates with the public civic grid at the street level. Starting underground, the developer must provide one equivalent car space for every 100 square meters of AAR built. For developments exceeding 1 hectare, at least 30% of all parking facilities must be designated as public parking. Moving up to the street line, the regulations prioritize what the policy calls active frontages. Ground floors facing public streets must feature pedestrian entry points, arcades, or transparent shop windows, eliminating blank walls. Through these specific ground plane rules, the private developer absorbs a portion of the civic burden. The building cannot wall itself off. It has to provide parking overflow for the neighborhood and create a safe, active pedestrian corridor for people walking to the nearby transit station. Executing a dense, mixed-use integration of this scale requires immense coordination, and historically, complex zoning applications die in bureaucratic bottlenecks. The 2026 modifications address this timeline directly. The policy establishes a dedicated TOD committee designed to bypass traditional delays, processing approvals within a strict 60-day window. Through the online sanction portal, if the authority fails to communicate a decision within that timeframe, the project is deemed automatically approved. Furthermore, the massive premiums paid by developers for that extra FAR do not enter a general government fund. Those specific TOD charges are ring-fenced in a dedicated escrow account, legally earmarked only to fund local multimodal infrastructure and area improvements around these exact transit nodes. This diagram shows the ultimate goal of the policy. When you take the rigid microgeometry of that single plot and replicate it across the hundreds of qualifying stations, the macro impact on the city becomes clear. The 2026 master plan prescribes a specific geometric future for the city. By binding the internal economy and physical mass of private developments to their proximity to rail lines, it mathematically engineers Delhi's evolution into a sustainable, transit-oriented metropolis.